Module 3 focuses on government and citizenship. In this first lesson, we're going to focus on a world of nations. The main ideas in this section that we're going to be looking at are that the world is divided into physical and human borders. The nations of the world interact through trade and foreign policy, and the nations of the world form a world community that resolves conflicts and addresses global issues. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Today, there are over 200 different countries in the world. Each of them has their own political boundaries that we call borders. Each country has its own smaller political units, such as cities, counties, states, and provinces, with their own set of borders. These boundaries are broken into two different types: physical borders and human borders. Sometimes borders follow natural boundaries, such as mountains, deserts, and oceans. Physical features make good natural borders because they are often difficult to cross and they are permanent markers. A prime example of this is the Andes Mountains in South America. They form the eastern border of Chile, while the Pacific Ocean forms Chile's western border. Rivers and lakes are also natural boundaries and are used to set borders. The Chattahoochee River forms part of the border between Alabama and Georgia. The Great Lakes form part of the border between the United States and Canada. Rivers can be challenging boundaries sometimes, as the flow of a river might shift course, which would change the border. Sometimes borders are determined by humans with no input from the physical landscape. These borders can be established as cultural borders or geometric borders. Let's learn more about both types. Cultural borders are based on cultural traits, such as language or religion. The border between mostly Muslim Pakistan and mostly Hindu India was established along religious lines. The border between Portugal and Spain is a cultural boundary that was caused or based on language. Geometric boundaries are borders that are not based on natural or cultural patterns. Often, they are straight lines based on lines of latitude or longitude. Take a look at the picture on the screen right now. The border between North and South Korea was established along the 38th parallel, or the 38 degrees north latitude line. Having identified borders is one characteristic of a sovereign nation. A sovereign nation is a government that has complete authority over a geographic area. Sovereign nations rule independently from governments outside their borders. They make and enforce their own laws, they collect taxes, they build armies, and make treaties with other countries. Sovereign nations rule independently, but they interact with other nations. One way they interact is through trade. Different nations have different resources. Trade allows nations to exchange goods that they have or can make for those that they are lacking. Another way nations interact is through foreign policy. Foreign policy is a nation's plan for how to act toward other countries. Foreign policy is important because actions that one country takes impact other nations. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. This was the beginning of World War II, which grew to involve almost every part of the world. Leaders of the world are concerned with keeping nations safe or national security. They try to secure friendly relations with other countries as part of their foreign policy. Nations use diplomacy, or foreign policy work designed to keep friendly relations with other countries. Diplomacy can be used to prevent war, solve problems, and open communication between countries. In 1961, the United States cut diplomatic ties with the country of Cuba, an island nation just south of Florida. In late 2014, President Obama announced that the United States would have diplomatic relations for the first time with Cuba. Another important foreign policy tool is foreign aid, or assistance that a country provides another country. The United States gave large amounts of foreign aid during and after World War II. It sent soldiers to help fight during the war, and after the war, we sent food, clothing, supplies, and money to help the people of Western Europe rebuild. Every country has its own goals to help it succeed. These goals make up the country's national interests. The United States has national interests in growing its economy and defending its national security. For a country like New Zealand, protecting its natural resources against climate change is one of its national interests. When nations have similar national interests, they can become allies, or a group that supports one another. A good example of this happened at the end of World War II in 1949. The United States and 11 other nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in order to stop a common enemy. The Soviet Union was taking over other countries in Eastern Europe and spreading communism. The 11 NATO countries found a common enemy in the USSR. NATO wanted to protect other nations from being invaded and to stop the spread of communism. Today, the Soviet Union no longer exists, but NATO has grown to include 28 different nations who share common interests. The nations of the world form a community. Countries are connected to each other through trade and diplomacy. What happens in one country can impact the entire planet. The world community must work together to promote cooperation in times of conflict and crisis. Conflicts arise between nations of the world. Wars, trade disputes, and political disagreements threaten peace. In 1945, 51 nations in the world created the United Nations, an organization of the world's countries that promotes peace and security around the globe. Today, there are more than 190 members of the United Nations. The organization promotes security by calling on quarreling countries to work out their disagreements peacefully. The United Nations can also put sanctions or penalties on those who have broken international laws. Sanctions can restrict or ban trade, travel, or economic activity. For example, the United Nations has placed sanctions against terrorist groups in the Middle East as a way to combat terrorism. When Russia invaded the Ukraine, the United Nations placed economic sanctions on Russia, designed to punish them for invading a foreign country while also keeping the war from spreading to other countries. The United Nations also works to guarantee human rights, or rights that all people on Earth deserve. Human rights include some political rights, such as the right to vote, freedom of expression, and the equality before the law. Nations also form organizations to help out areas of conflict. Those organizations provide humanitarian aid, or assistance to people in distress. During the Syrian civil war, the International Committee of the Red Cross brought food, clean water, and essential aid to civilians there. Another organization called the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, offers assistance to nations that are in conflict or are poverty-stricken. They have built or rehabilitated 1,040 schools since 2009. Doctors Without Borders provides medical aid to those fleeing areas of armed conflict, such as the South Sudan, Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan. These organizations are able to help in conflict zones because of the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions are a series of international agreements that tell countries at war how to treat people and protect them. For example, people cannot be held hostage, enslaved, or tortured. The Geneva Conventions protect the rights of the civilians, medics, and aid workers who are not taking part in the fighting. During times of crisis, the world community promotes cooperation. Disasters can leave thousands of people in need. Earthquakes, floods, and droughts can cause crises around the world. In 2004, a tsunami devastated parts of Southeast Asia. Many organizations stepped in to provide humanitarian aid to the victims. Doctors Without Borders provides care in places that are hit hard by epidemics or natural disasters. Deadly diseases such as tuberculosis, malaria, and acquired immune deficiency syndrome, also known as AIDS, can be spread quickly and devastate entire communities. AIDS is a worldwide problem, but about 70% of all those infected with HIV live in sub-Saharan Africa. This is why nations work with healthcare initiatives or organizations that raise money to help combat diseases, so that we can stop the spread of those diseases worldwide.